I think it's fair to say people are pessimistic about the 2025 New York Jets, but there are some statistics that suggest this team might be better than you think. I'll give them to you today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It is Thursday, April 10th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GettingGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, on today's show, we're going to look at some statistics that suggest that the 2025 New York Jets are going to be better than you think. We'll talk about a player who had a breakout 2024 and why numbers suggest he should be able to sustain his success. We'll talk about a player who had a disappointing 2024 and explain why he wasn't quite as bad as you might think. And we'll talk about the most important position on the field, the quarterback position, and why, at the very least, we should not expect a downgrade there. Now, I think a lot of Jets fans and members of the media are very pessimistic about what 2025 is going to look like for this team. And look, that's easy to understand. The 2024 New York Jets were not just the most disappointing team of the season, they were the most disappointing team in recent memory. They made a lot of very splashy, big-name acquisitions in the offseason. The team did little to try and bring down expectations. The team really tried to pump itself up in the preseason. There was all sorts of media hype around it, and they ended up going 5-12. And this is capping what is now a 14-year playoff drought. It's been 14 years since the Jets made the playoffs, and they have not had a winning season since 2015. So a really long drought. I think by default now, people are expecting bad things for the New York Jets. That may not be the worst thing in the world, though. Now, I don't know that the Jets are really going to be a playoff team next year, but I think that they have a good shot to be better than expected. And I think last year maybe there was a little bit of irrational exuberance because of all the big name players the Jets had without factoring in factors like the coaching staff or the age of those players, because Jets experienced a lot of age-related decline. Right now, our partners at FanDuel, they just released their over-unders for expected win totals for NFL teams in 2025. The Jets came in at 5.5 wins, which was just about where they were last year. They were 5-12. So FanDuel, right now the expectation is that Jets will probably be about the same level of a team next year. There are some people who are actually expecting the team to get worse. And I think a lot of it goes to the quarterback position, where the Jets are moving off a future Hall of Fame quarterback in Aaron Rodgers and bringing in a guy who is frankly a reclamation project in Justin Fields. I think if you're being objective about this, Fields has been a disappointment in his career. And that's why he's on his third team entering year 5 in the league. That's why the Bears traded him to Pittsburgh and did not get a whole lot in return for him. But the one thing I'd say is, if you're comparing Justin Fields with Aaron Rodgers' career, there's no comparison. Aaron Rodgers is a 4-time MVP. Aaron Rodgers is one of the greatest quarterbacks to ever play the game. That said, and I think this has been true for much of the offseason. It was true through the early part of the offseason when it was not entirely clear what the Jets would do. And there was an argument, well, who's going to be as good as Aaron Rodgers? Well, the thing is, Aaron Rodgers wasn't that good last year. And we can just compare some of the key statistics with Justin Fields. You want to talk about completion percentage? Rodgers was at 63%. Fields was at 65.8 in 2024. Fields started 6 games for the Steelers. So Rodgers 63, Fields 65.8. If you want to talk about yards per attempt last year, Rodgers 6.7, Fields 6.9. Again, Justin Fields outshines Aaron Rodgers there. If you want to talk about passer rating, Rodgers 90.5, Fields 93.3. So again, Fields a little bit better. Want to talk QBR, which is ESPN's proprietary stat, Rodgers 48, Fields 50.8. So really, if you look, Fields was actually, in the games he started last year, a little bit more productive than Rodgers across a number of key metrics. Now, this does not mean that Justin Fields is a better quarterback than Aaron Rodgers over the course of their respective careers. That would be a ridiculous thing to state. But what I do think is the media probably undersold the level to which Aaron Rodgers declined. Now, if you were watching the games, I mean, you saw that Rodgers' mobility really didn't exist anymore. He looked, he really could not move anywhere near the level he did during his Green Bay days. There were a couple of games where, I don't know, maybe the Achilles was feeling good or something. There were a couple of games where he moved around pretty well, but for the most part, his mobility was very, very limited. And aside from that, I mean, I think you could see over the course of the season that, well, his arm is, still, his arm isn't like weak when we're talking NFL standards, but his arm is not what it was in the Green Bay days. So, look, I think at a minimum, you can probably expect Justin Fields to play at the level Aaron Rodgers did last year. But there's a key difference is right now, Aaron Rodgers is 41 years old. Justin Fields at the start of the season is going to be 26 years old. So we could also talk about trajectories. Aaron Rodgers clearly, while you have to respect what he did through much of his career, while he is an immortal player, while he will be a first ballot Hall of Famer without any doubt, he is clearly, in the decline phase of his career. And if he continues his career next season in a new city, you're not going to see the vintage Aaron Rodgers from Green Bay anymore. You're not going to see the top 10 quarterback anymore. Fields, there was a tick up in his play from what he did in Chicago last year with the Steelers. Now, I think it's a fair question to ask, will he just plateau? Will he improve? But there is a chance that in the right scenario, in the right system, with the right supporting cast, maybe there's more to Fields than we've seen. And this is something we've spoken frequently about on this show, that it is not easy for a young quarterback to step in and play in the NFL. And if you have somebody who's, an exceptional prospect, if you have, a CJ Stroud or Joe Burrow or a Justin Herbert who can step in and play at a high level right off the bat, that's a great thing. The fact of the matter is most quarterbacks, when they're immediately drafted, are not ready to do that. But sometimes they need a couple of years to truly adapt to the NFL, the speed of the game, the complexity of the offensive system, the complexity of the looks the defense gives you, just the fact that it's now your full-time job. There's a lot to adjust to. And what I would say is that I don't think there's going to be a downgraded quarterback. I think that a lot of people are looking at the situation and thinking that it's an automatic guaranteed downgrade. And look, I don't think that that's like an outrageous thing to think, because if you're thinking logically about this, you're going from Aaron Rodgers to Justin Fields. Your first instinct, unless you your first instinct is always going to be, well, that's going to be a big downgrade. So I understand it. It's just, I think when you actually look at the numbers, I think when you actually look at this under a microscope, there's no downgrade to be had. And it's quite possible the Jets actually get better quarterback play this year out of Justin Fields than they got from Aaron Rodgers in 2024. Now, look, I'm not going to lie. Part of this is just, I think people kind of underrated the extent to which Rodgers has declined. And I think part of it, there's a huge reverence for Rodgers in the NFL national media, the people that kind of set the terms of the discussion, the people who are really, really driving the discourse. They still talk about Aaron Rodgers like he's Green Bay Aaron Rodgers, like he's an MVP candidate. But if you look a little bit closer under the hood, Fields was actually a little bit better than Rodgers. And Fields got benched, which again shows you what the situation was in New York last year with Rodgers. That Rodgers played actually a little bit behind a quarterback who got benched statistically. But there is upside with Fields. And I think that there's a real opportunity for this to be an upgrade of the quarterback position this year for the Jets, and quarterback's the most important position on the field. I know it's a little counterintuitive, but there's truth to it. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue to be counterintuitive, because there is a big name Jet who, by most accounts, had a down year last year, but it wasn't as bad as a lot of people think it was. And there's every reason to expect him to bounce back. We'll talk about who that is and why that is, continuing here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. There's nothing like the energy of a live game, whether it's catching a last-minute Major League Baseball showdown or soaking in the excitement of an NBA matchup. But finding seats at a great price, that used to be a challenge until Game Time came along. Game Time takes scoring last-minute tickets to events easier than ever. Prices actually drop as the event gets closer, and with their all-in pricing, you can see the total cost up front, no surprises at checkout. I don't just tell you about Game Time. I've used it myself, and not just for sports. Look, you can find any matchup you want on Game Time, but if you want to go to see theater, if you want to go to a concert, if you want to, anything you could want to go to, Game Time's got a deal for you. And you know what I really like? I really like that they give you the view from your seat. You can see a picture of what it's going to look like from your seat before you arrive, so no surprises. You'll know exactly what your view is going to look like. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL. Locked On NFL, one word, no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today we're looking at some numbers that suggest 2025 could be better than you expect for the Jets and better than 2024 was. And there's a player who had what was perceived as a really rough 2024, who I'm expecting to bounce back in a big way in 2025, and that's Sauce Gardner. But over the last couple of weeks, I've been thinking about this, and while I was critical of Sauce during 2024, and a lot of people were critical of Sauce during 2024, the more like I look back on this and, I go back and rewatch some of the film, it wasn't as bad as like it was made out to be. It was not a disaster season. Now, I think when you have when you've set the bar as high as Sauce Gardner, anything other than truly elite level play is going to look bad. And look, there were some issues with Sauce last year. Clearly was not very effective at tackling guys in space. That was true his first two seasons, but he really got exposed there last year. Also, a lot of penalties. That's part of Sauce's game. Sauce is, very grabby. And he got away with stuff his first 2 years that he did not get away with in year three. And I think he got off to a rough start in the season. Sometimes first impressions last a long time. When you see a guy struggle early in the year, sometimes it just lasts with you. It lingers for a while. And I think that's what happened with Sauce Gardner. But you're looking back, he really didn't play that badly. And I was going through some statistics that kind of suggested this. Then I came across an older tweet from my friend Michael Nani, who appears on the show a lot. And he came up with, he tweeted out Sauce Gardner's some of his key numbers. 490 cover snaps, 53.2% completion percentage, 391 yards allowed, 1 touchdown, 1 interceptions. And Nania noted he was only one of 3 corners to allow less than 2 touchdowns and less than 400 yards while playing more than 400 coverage snaps, along with Cooper DeJean and Patrick Surtain. So, he was actually still pretty good in coverage last year. Again, there were some rough games along the line, and it was not a vintage Sauce Gardner season. And look, when you make first team All-Pro your first 2 years, and then you take a step back year 3, you're going to be a target of criticism. But again, the numbers suggest that he wasn't that bad. Again, only 3 corners allowed less than 2 touchdowns and less than 400 yards while playing more than 400 coverage snaps. So it shows you, he still was playing at a reasonably high level. A bad season for Sauce Gardner is better than a good season for a lot of corners. And, the penalties were bad, but he actually had less penalties than Patrick Surtain, who was viewed as the top corner in the league last season. And rightly so. I mean, I think Surtain was the best corner in the NFL, but Sauce Gardner can play at the level of a Patrick Surtain. And I think that this is going to be a big year for Sauce Gardner. I think that you have a system put into place by Aaron Glenn that's really going to accentuate how valuable Sauce Gardner could be. I don't know that I quite want to compare this to 2009 when Rex Ryan came in and what happened with Darrelle Revis. And the reason for that is, first of all, Revis is in the Hall of Fame. Second of all, I don't think people realized how good Revis was before 2009. Revis went to the Pro Bowl in 2008, but he kind of slid under the radar as a truly elite cover corner. It wasn't until Rex Ryan came in and started bragging about him that people started to pick up on how good Revis was. But Rex Ryan instilled a heavy blitzing scheme with a lot of man-to-man coverage. And that's where Revis really excelled. And it wasn't so much that Rex Ryan developed Revis as it was that he put in a scheme where he asked a lot out of Revis. And Revis's skill set was perfect for the scheme. Eric Mangini did not run as heavy of a man-to-man package, and he didn't blitz nearly as much as Rex Ryan did. Mangini's defense was much more vanilla. It was much more of a classic 3-4 front. There was lots of zone coverage, and Revis did not shadow the other team's number 1 receiver the way he did under Rex Ryan. But Revis's ability to cover the other team's best receiver one-on-one, frequently without help, and follow him across formations. If the other team's best receiver went left, Revis went left with him. If the other team's best receiver went right, Revis went right with him. No matter who it was, the number 1 receiver, if he was an elite player, was going to see Revis no matter where he lined up every single play. And I think the Jets have the ability to do something like that with Sauce Gardner. And in some ways, Sauce's talents were not maximized in the Robert Saleh defense, because Saleh was always a coach who liked to play rush 4 and play zone coverage behind it. And Sauce Gardner still played really well there. He was first team All-Pro twice his first 2 years in the league. And even though he wasn't asked to play man coverage as much, he was outstanding playing man coverage. But there aren't many guys in the league, and Surtain is one of them. There are a couple other guys, but the current rules in the league just do not allow you to play man coverage all that much. I see a lot of questions. Why do teams play zone so much? Well, it's because it's so hard to play man coverage when you can't touch the other team's receiver. And through the years, less and less is now legal when you're talking about using your hands to disrupt a receiver as a corner. So you have to be a truly exceptional athlete. You have to have truly exceptional instincts, truly exceptional skills to be able to hold up man-to-man. And when you find a guy like that, he is super valuable. I always hear there's one debate, who, if the Jets could only afford to keep one of Garrett Wilson or Sauce Gardner, who should they keep? And it's an academic debate, because in reality, the Jets should keep both of these guys. If the Jets let either of them go, then they're being very foolish. But I think the clear answer is that in a world where this was not true, and by the way, it is true, the Jets can keep both. But in a world where it was not true, I think Sauce Gardner would be the answer, because there were 21 receivers who had 1,000-yard seasons last year. So it is doable to find a 1,000-yard receiver. There are only a handful of guys you can trust to hold up one-on-one on an island as a man-to-man corner. Sauce Gardner is one of them. I mean, there may only be, you might be able to count them on one hand. A corner who can cover one-on-one in man coverage and do it at a high level is an extremely rare commodity in the NFL. And that's why Sauce Gardner is going to get a huge payday if the Jets have any sense in them and bring it back. But I think we're reaching a point where the defense was previously built around the line. Because if you're only rushing 4, you got to have good pass rushers, because they're not going to get help from blitzers. One of the 4 guys has to get home. And there's a reason the Jets invested so much on the defensive line to have quality depth, to be able to rotate guys frequently in and out, because you always wanted to be able to get to the quarterback. And if you're not going to blitz, then the defensive linemen have to do the job. We're switching now to an Aaron Glenn type defense, where the Jets are likely to blitz as much as any team in the league. That means you're going to have a lot of one-on-one coverage on the back end. And when you have a corner who can shut down the elite receivers of this league one-on-one, it is a huge advantage for your team. It gives you peace of mind, because the weakness of the blitz is that your guys are exposed one-on-one in a league which essentially builds rules to prevent you from being able to hold up one-on-one in coverage. There's going to be peace of mind now, because even if the blitz doesn't get home immediately, the other team's receiver is not going to be able to get open. And again, even in a year where most of us viewed it as a disappointment, even a year where it was viewed as a down season for Sauce Gardner, he still covered at a really high rate. He's not much of a tackler. He's never been much of a tackler, though. I mean, if you watch him his first 2 years, he struggles tackling in space. Would you rather have a corner who tackles well than a corner who tackles poorly? Of course you would. But you don't get corners for their tackling skills. You get your corners for their ability to match up against other teams' receivers, especially the good ones. You get corners for the ability to hold up one-on-one. And that's what Sauce Gardner can do. And even in a down year, and I think there's this concern in the fan base after the year he had in 2024. Well, were those first 2 years a mirage? Is he heading downhill? Is he in decline now? Will we ever see the player those first 2 years again? I think the answer is yes, because I think we're getting into a system that's going to accentuate his skills. And I think even in a bad year, he was still pretty good. The numbers, sometimes numbers lie. There's the old saying, we have language rules on words I'm allowed to use on the Locked On Podcast Network. So I'm going to alter an old expression. There's an expression, there are lies, darned lies, and statistics. It's a different word, but I'm not allowed to use it. But in this case, these statistics are right. I mean, Sauce Gardner did not give up a whole lot in coverage last year, even in what was a down year for him. Now, during the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to a guy the Jets drafted 2 years ago, who was a very controversial pick at the time, Will McDonald, who just had a breakout season statistically. And there are other numbers that suggest that's going to be sustainable. And I'll explain what those numbers are as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Thursday. We're going through some statistics that could say good things about the 2025 New York Jets on today's episode. I'm going to close out the show by talking about a player who's very interesting to me, and that's Will McDonald, who of course was the first round pick out of Iowa State 2 years ago. I think it's fair to say that when the Jets selected him in 2023, it certainly raised some eyebrows because at that point, the Jets needed a lot of help on offense. And if you go back to that time frame, it was generally assumed that the Jets would either pick a wide receiver or an offensive lineman. The Jets did not seem to need a lot of, at least at the time, the Jets did not need a lot of help on the defensive line, particularly at defensive end. But one thing I always say is that you can't draft solely based on immediate needs because your immediate needs change from year to year. What you should be looking to do is add great players so you can build positions of strength. And if you look at where the Jets are right now, if anything, I mean, they could probably use some help at defensive end, despite Will McDonald looking like he's going to turn out to be a pretty good player. McDonald had double-digit sacks last year, which was not entirely expected. But so there are like lots of different layers to what Will McDonald did last year because he did hit the double-digit mark in sacks. There is a bit of skepticism about him though, because a lot of these sacks came early in the year where plays where he wasn't blocked. And, sometimes sacks just come because you're in the right place at the right time. Sometimes they're not because you dominate. Sometimes, you just get on, offense busts in the assignment and you sack the guy. And people always go, well, I don't care. A sack's a sack. You could have missed him. And yeah, he could have missed him, but he also could have been blocked, So you have to figure out, is a sack level sustainable? Now, let me give you the positive. I don't think Will McDonald's going to be blocked go unblocked at the rate he did early last season. But if you go through his numbers, he got a pressure about 13% of the time when he rushed the quarterback. And that's a pretty good number. It's not up there with the truly elite level players. It's not like Myles Garrett is higher, but a couple guys who were at 13% last year, Brian Burns and Danielle Hunter, both of them are pretty good pass rushers. So that's a real sign that what Will McDonald did last year was sustainable. If you watch the film, he's got a good combo. And, it's like when you're a pass rusher, you don't need 7 different moves. And now if you have 7 different moves that are all good, it makes you a really dynamic pass rusher. But really what you just need are moves that complement each other. And McDonald's got 2 good moves that complement each other. He's got the speed rush, which is essentially just you go upfield as fast as you can. You hope if the tackle slow-footed, you're just going to get past him. He's also got a spin move, though, which means you shoot up the field the same way, but instead of going past the lineman, if he oversets, you spin back inside. And when you have 2 moves that complement each other, you can be a pass rusher in this league. A lot of guys don't have 2 moves that complement each other. The fact McDonald does, is a very positive sign for him. And again, that 13% pressure rate, that's pretty good. That's a really solid number. And so why does the pressure rate matter? Well, what I'm about to say is going to be controversial. And I don't want to, and I'm probably taking it too far when I say this. So it's a bit of an overstatement. But generally speaking, a pressure comes because a defensive lineman beats a block. Now, not always. Again, there are plays where you're on block where you get to the quarterback. But generally speaking, for the most part, when you get a pressure, it's because the defensive lineman did something right. Generally speaking, again, not always, but generally speaking, when there's a sack, it's because the quarterback did something wrong. Yeah, there are the plays where you just annihilate an offensive lineman off the snap and the quarterback goes down like that in 2 seconds. But generally speaking, a lot of sacks happen because the quarterback holds the ball for too long or steps into pressure or something like that. So this is why you hear this a lot, and it's true. Your pressure rate is a good predictor of your future sack rate. If you have a high sack total but a low pressure rate, odds are your sack total is going to go down in the future. And if you have a low sack total with a high pressure rate, odds are your sacks are going to go up in the future. Because if you have a high sack total with a low pressure rate, odds are you got kind of lucky. You just face quarterbacks who are holding the ball too long, and you'll start to face in the future. You'll face better quarterbacks who won't take as many sacks. And you may have been unlucky if you have a high pressure rate and low sack total. Quarterbacks with lightning quick releases. Again, don't take this too far. There are obviously situations where a quarterback gets a pressure. I'm sorry, where a defensive lineman gets a pressure and was unblocked. There are cases where you just annihilate a guy off the line of scrimmage and the quarterback goes down immediately. But generally speaking, a pressure rate's a better predictor of future sack total than the number of sacks you get. And so for McDonald, the fact he had a lot of pressures last year is a very positive thing. Now, there's some stuff that's unknown about McDonald right now, because a year ago we were talking about, and the Jets were talking about having McDonald add muscle to his frame. When he was drafted, he was only 235 pounds. Kind of got thrown around his rookie season. So year 2, the Jets made a very big deal about the idea McDonald was going to add muscle, he was going to add weight so he could hold up. And then we get to training camp, and Robert Saleh says, "No, we decided to keep him at the same weight." And McDonald had a lot of struggles holding up in the run game. He was very ineffective at setting the edge last year. He was a very effective pass rusher, but he was a very ineffective run defender. The thing is, and I'm not with McDonald every day, but at least when he was drafted, it seemed like he had the frame to put on extra muscle without sacrificing his explosion. He was a guy who just seemed like he was not filled out in his frame. And there's a big difference. Some guys, if a guy has as much muscle as he can put on, and he adds more, he's going to slow down. But McDonald seems, he seemed kind of small on the smaller side. So it seemed like he could bulk up and still be just as explosive as a pass rusher, just be just as quick out of the blocks. And if he can do that, and he can hold up better against the run and be a 3-down player, then I think he could be a double-digit sack guy again. If he can't, if the Jets keep him around like 235, 240, then I think his best role might be as a situational pass rusher, not playing on rundowns, because he does struggle. He has struggled as a run defender playing at his current size. So there's a lot that's unknown about McDonald. I think you really have to go deep into the data to figure out what his 2024 season means, because at the first blush, a lot of sacks on plays where he was on block, but on the other hand, he's actually still generating pressures at a high rate, which suggests that even if those sacks that came kind of by chance dry up, he'll still get to the quarterback frequently enough to pick up a bunch of sacks on his own accord. The other question is, does he put on more muscle? So if he does, maybe he can play. Maybe he can increase his playing time and not hurt the Jets on run defense. If he can't, I think they might want to reduce his snap total, which could reduce his sack count. But either way, I think there's a lot to feel good about with Will McDonald as a pass rusher. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.